Hi everyone, today we are going to study another element of logical design, that is the reports design. In our previous video we studied form design within logical design. Now today we are going to see report designs. System outputs are designed through reports. So just like in our previous video we saw that the system inputs were taken through forms, similarly system outputs are designed through reports. So just like we have forms for inputs, we have reports for outputs. Outputs can be classified according to two characteristics. The first characteristic is their distribution inside or outside the organization and the people who read and use them. So the first characteristic that defines outputs is how they are distributed inside the organization or outside the organization, and then who are the people who will be reading those outputs and using those outputs. And the second characteristic that defines outputs is their implementation method, that is how those outputs are implemented. Now there are different types of outputs. So if we study the types of outputs, the first category is the internal outputs. Internal outputs are intended for the owners of the system and the users within the organization. So that means internal outputs are those outputs which are generated for the owners of the system, the people who will be using the system, for those owners and the users who are working within the organizations. Such outputs, that means the internal outputs, are intended for this category of the people. Then the second category is of external outputs. Now before we study external outputs, we must know that if we talk of internal outputs, there are three subclasses of internal outputs. That means further you can classify internal outputs into three subcategories. What are these three subcategories? The first one is detailed reports, second one is your summary reports, and third one is your exception reports. Now let's get into the details of each of these subcategories. The detailed reports present information with little or no filtering or restriction. So whatever information is presented through outputs in the form of detailed reports, that is with little or no filters, and there are no restrictions in these kind of outputs. Then is the summary reports. When the outputs are presented as summary reports, then they categorize information for managers specifically who are not interested in going through the details. And then is the last subcategory of internal outputs, that is exception reports. So when outputs are presented in the form of exception reports, they basically filter data before it is presented to the manager as information, because only that data is presented which is of importance to the managers or which is relevant to the managers. So basically before presenting any information to the managers, the data is filtered in the form of exception reports. Then is the second category of outputs, which is your external outputs. The external outputs are intended for customers, suppliers, partners and regulatory agencies or government bodies. So basically it's just the opposite of internal outputs. While the internal outputs were intended for people within the organization, external outputs are intended for people outside the organization, which includes a wide variety of people, from the customers, the suppliers, the partners and any regulatory agencies or government bodies. They usually conclude on business transactions. And if we consider the examples of external outputs, these are your invoices that are generated, the account statements that are generated, the paychecks, the course schedules, telephone bills, etc. These are all examples of external outputs. Then we will look at the implementation methods for outputs. That means how are these outputs implemented. So following are commonly used output formats. The first one is your tabular format. When I say tabular format, it's clear from the name itself that it is in the form of a table. So basically, when I present output in a tabular format, that is as tabular output, it presents information as rows and columns of text and numbers, just like we do in case of tables. Then the second format for output is zoned output. In this format, it places text and numbers into designated areas or boxes of a form or screen. So basically there is a form or screen and there are designated areas or boxes in which the output is placed in the form of text and numbers, hence the name zoned output. Then the third category or the third way of implementing outputs is as screen outputs. In this format, it is an online display of information on a visual display device. It could be any screen such as your CRT terminal or PC monitor. CRT terminal, you know, is a cathode ray tube terminal. Again, it is a screen, and PC monitor, that is your personal computer's monitor, that is also a screen. So basically, online the information is displayed on some kinds of screens. Then the fourth method for implementing outputs is through the graphic output. So basically, graphic output means presenting the output graphically. That means not as text or numbers but through pictures. So it is the use of a picture to convey information in ways that demonstrate trends and relationships not easily seen in the tabular output. So there are various guidelines for output design. Now what are these guidelines that we must all follow while designing outputs are? First of all, computer outputs should be simple to read and interpret. Every person from a computer expert to a layman must be able to read those outputs and then interpret those outputs. The second guideline is that timing of computer outputs is important. At what time those outputs are generated, that plays a very important role. So outputs must be generated at the time when they are required. The third guideline says that the distribution or access of computer outputs must be sufficient to assist all relevant system users. Whosoever are these system users, whatever category they fall into, the distribution of outputs should be such that, or the access of outputs should be made available in such a manner that it is sufficient to assist all the relevant system users. And the fourth and last guideline says that computer outputs must be acceptable to the system users who will receive them. They must be valid, they must be consistent, and they must be correct, and hence they must be acceptable to the system users who are going to receive them. Then there are some steps to be followed during the process of output design. So what are these steps? They say that identify system outputs and review logical requirements. Once you identify what the system outputs are and review what are the logical requirements of this particular system, then in the second step, you must specify physical output requirements. What are the physical output requirements? That is how physically the output will be made available, in what particular format, and all such things. And then last, as necessary, design any pre-printed external forms. If there are any pre-printed external forms that are required, they must be designed. So this is all about your report design.